Greetings and salutations, friends. So, today we will be covering the Tomb King's army, of course, a pretty damn quick and relatively fragile army. They're not quite the glass cannons that are the Wood Elves, but they are most certainly not a grindy army either. Although being undead, they don't break much. In fact, I'm pretty sure everything in their army is immune to fear, as there is nothing living in the Tomb King's army. Even though they are technically a sentient race of, well, undead, and in some cases sapient, they do not, in fact, flee, because the normal foot soldiers, they don't retain enough of their humanity to be affected by things like fear or anything like that, and even the Tomb Kings themselves can't really rout, essentially just because, well, they've already died once. At this point, death holds little fear to them. They could just be resurrected anyway, so who cares? And the leader of this bunch of sentient undead has to be Cetra the Imperishable, the greatest High King of the Tomb Kings. Cetra is an interesting special character. He hits like a ton of bricks, but he's also really fragile, although he has a 4+ ward save, which makes him able to withstand some of the incoming beating. But, well, he's in a chariot, and a rather large one, so he kinda needs that ward save, as he's also a remarkably large target, so it's kinda hard to miss the bastard once you've actually got him in your sights. All in all, in a total wargame, he should probably be implemented much like he is tabletop. Give him a nice big chariot pulled by 4 undead horses, give him an absolute ridiculous charge, but not a whole lot of staying power. And that would make him reasonably useful. Of course, you need to add up a unit of other chariots around him to really get the most out of him and make sure you actually break the enemy you're charging, but he could certainly be an interesting special character if properly done. And he does kind of, shall I say, embody the army rather well. The Tomb King's army is a really good army when you use them correctly, but they are by no means newbie friendly, and being as fragile as they are, and not having quite the oomph of the Wood Elves, like the Wood Elves can simply just shoot opposing armies into tiny little scrumming pieces. The Tomb Kings do not have this luxury. They actually do have to get up there nice close and personal and beat the shit out of the enemy in close combat more often than not. So, it has a few special rules, of course the normal undead rules, meaning that they're not going to be running away anytime soon, but they also have a rather massive weakness. As in an undead vampire count's army, if your army general gets killed, your army is going to start crumbling, which is a problem to say the absolute least, and the Tomb King's army has much the same problem. You have to take a priest of the mortuary cult, a Lich Priest, Lich High Priest, to be the army's Hierophant. The Hierophant is the guy who actually awakens the army, the one who gets it into battle, and the one who is responsible for keeping it on its legs. So if he dies, your army will start crumbling, which is very bad indeed. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure you want to implement this in a total wargame, because it would mean that you'd basically have one target in the enemy army, and you'd point every single artillery piece you have against that one target, in the hope of making your enemy army fall apart. Which seems like a rather massive weakness, of course, but we'll see. I'm not entirely sure on how they would implement that, although I think probably the best solution would be to do something along the lines of the Vampire Count, where if your army general dies, and you can have multiple Hierophants in this case, then you take a rather significant damage reduction, I'd say. Your units get weaker because the magic that is keeping them going is getting weaker. They start to fall apart, they become less effective. I think that would be a little bit more in line, but even then, it's a remarkably large weakness for a already remarkably fragile army, so not entirely sure about that one. We'll have to wait and see how they've intended to implement that. However, moving on to the generic special characters, we start out with the Tomb Kings and the Tomb Princes. Essentially, the Tomb King and the Tomb Prince is the same unit, except the Prince is slightly smaller, slightly cheaper. They are essentially melee generals and can be kitted out to be quite dangerous in combat, but here's the really interesting thing, yeah? They have a special ability, a kind of a magic phase, so to say. The Tomb King is capable of using an ability called My Will Be Done, because normally a undead army is not capable of marching. Now, in Total War terms, that doesn't matter too much. In Warhammer terms, that is huge. Normally, your units can only move their movement allowance, so say a unit can move 4 inches, okay. But if they march, they can move 8 inches. And this rather large discrepancy in mobility can often be the difference between victory and defeat, and with the Tomb Kings being unable to march, they start out with a rather considerable downside. However, the way I would like this to actually be implemented in Total War game, basically, your generic combat characters of the Tomb Kings and the Tomb Prince has an ability. The ability is called My Will Be Done, just as in the tabletop, and it boosts one or more of your units, either in an AoE sort or in a targeted sort. It makes the unit move faster, it increases its charge, it increases its melee damage. It's just a general all-around buff to represent the fact that the Tomb King is channeling a considerable part of his vast magical and willpower into the unit, improving its abilities. Maybe we might even do like the Tomb King is more expensive and rarer, and he has the AoE ability, while the Tomb Prince has a single targeted ability, something along those lines. And this would mean that the Tomb King's army would require a considerable bit of micromanaging to get the most out of it. You'll need several special characters to really get it rolling, and you'll need to be continuously using your My Will Be Done abilities. And of course, like I said, they're not terrible combat lords. They're not going to be taking on a Chaos Champion anytime soon, but mount a Tomb King on a chariot and put him in a unit of other chariots, and you've got one hell of a hard-punching unit. Of course, that does depend on how they're actually going to be doing chariots in the game, yeah? Because so far they have, well, never really done chariots properly. But if they have any intentions of adding in the Tomb Kings, they're going to have to, because chariots is one of the biggest parts of your army. Now, the Tomb King chariots are somewhat unlike the early Egyptian chariots of our own history, where the chariots was used practically just as a delivery system to actually get troops into battle. You could have 2 horses carrying 2 or even 4 men in a chariot, rather than having 1 or 2 men actually ride the horses. But later on, they evolved to, first of all, a skirmishing platform where you had a driver and 1 or 2 archers or a javelin men, and later into a heavy combat form where they were essentially used as super heavy shock cavalry, so to say. The Chariots of the Tomb Kings is probably closer to that lighter version. They are there for large charges into the enemy. They should really work as a bit of a shock unit. They should charge into the unit and try to charge out again, while the models on the chariot swing their rather large two-handed, essentially axes, out alongside the chariot, trying to catch enemy units. Of course, that is first of all going to require chariots that are intelligent enough to hit the enemy army front on, pass through the enemy unit, just continuing on their gallop, and then turn around and pass through the unit again, and continue until it has been stopped. And it's also going to require animation, and somehow a way of having the unit attack from the chariot while it's moving. So that one could be pretty damn hard, especially with the current engine, which it appears that they are going to be keeping, so we'll have to wait and see. They have previously done miracles with that engine, to be completely honest, so they might be able to pull something out of the bag, although we shall simply just have to wait and see on that one. Moving on though, we have the Lich Priest and Lich High Priest, which is again much like the Tomb King and Tomb Prince. You've essentially got the smaller Lich Priest and the bigger badder High Priest. Now, if you don't have Cetra, which is the only Tomb King that can also be taken as the army's Hierophant, one of these characters will be the Hierophant of your army, so essentially the Necromancer compared to an undead army. Now, these have access to a special lore of magic. This lore of magic is called Lord of Nehekara. And this works a little bit different from the established laws, so I'll go over that in particular because the Lord of Nehekara really is a really big deal when it comes to playing Tomb Kings correctly, and again, while we don't know how they're actually going to implement all of that, I'll just do my good old-fashioned speculation, shall I? So, we start out with the Tomb King's signature spell. This is essentially the spell version of My Will Be Done, and should work just like it. Your Hierophant has an AoE ability that enhances units in a, I'd say, reasonably large area. You should be able to enhance 2 or 3 units at the same time with this spell, which will increase movement speed, charge speed, melee, all of that good stuff for 30-40 seconds, something along those lines. And they also have a variety of more interesting spells. My personal favorite, you can imbue a unit with the Killing Blow special rule, which is a really interesting thing in a Tomb King's army. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure how they would actually implement Killing Blow in a Total War game, but let's say that they get basically just a massively increased damage against the big guys. Having a spell that could increase your damage against big guys could suddenly make that previously quite innocent unit of skeleton warriors into a real threat to your big nasty ogres. They also have spells that impart ward saves to normal units, a 5+, so 25% war save, pretty damn good. And they have a beefed up version of My Will Be Done, which, well, should simply be a beefed up version. You target one unit, and that unit gets a rather considerable increase in its attack speed, attack damage, attack skill, all of these good things. So, as you probably already noticed, the vast majority, or in fact, all of these spells, are spells that help your units, rather than simply just blast to pieces your enemy. And this is something I do hope we see implemented in Total War Warhammer, especially if they actually have any plans of adding in the Tomb Kings, the ability to turn a rather docile and not particularly good unit of skeleton warriors into some proper combat monsters for a relatively short period of time with the use of magic, could make the Tomb Kings a very interesting and very micro-intensive army to play as. Then we've got 2 combat characters. We've got the Tomb Herald, which is just about bog standard combat character. He's got far worse stats than Tomb Kings or Prince, but he's also a hell of a lot cheaper. A nice generic combat hero to put in the front line of your units to give them a little bit more oomph, but nothing particularly special. What I do consider to be a little bit special, though, is the Necrotech. The Necrotech is not a combat character unlike the Tomb Herald, however, he has a really amazing ability. He gives the special rule of hatred against everything, literally, to any unit he joins, which is potentially quite powerful, as that of course increases the weapon skill and weapon damage and just general attack of any unit he joins, which again, combine that with My Will Be Done and general enhancement spells, you could have some proper super units in the army of Tomb Kings. Additionally, the Necrotech is also the person responsible for waking up the great big constructs of the Tomb King armies, and such, any animated construct within 12 inches, so I'd consider it to be roughly a command aura or so in a Total War game, gains a regeneration of 6+, so on a dice roll of 6, it regains a wound. In this case, in a Total War game, I'd really just like to see that it would be a bit of a repair ability. The construct has to be disengaged, it can't be in combat of course, because that'd be kind of bullshit. But if the construct is not in combat, and if it is within a certain range of the Necrotech can use an ability that essentially repairs the construct a bit. Again, it rewards micro, which is really a thing that should be primary to the Tomb Kings. And I'm going to be harping on that fair bit, so you'll have to excuse me. But yeah, the Necrotech is a potentially really interesting unit, although he is somewhat fragile to say the absolute least, and he's by no means a combat character, so Considering you kind of have to have him in a unit to get the full potential out of him, and that unit has to be in combat, well, it's certainly a trade-off, but it might be one that's worthwhile. Moving on to the core units, you have the good old skeleton warriors. Your basic infantry, and yeah, they're pretty terrible. But with all of the buffs available in the Tomb King's army, what is a relatively terrible unit can quite quickly turn around to be a pretty damn interesting unit. Additionally, of course, they are undead, so they are unbreakable, immune to psychology, immune to morale, all of that stuff, and the units can be replenished, much like in a normal Vampire Count army, via the help of magic, so you can add additional units to the unit. So, say you got 120 skeleton warriors to begin with. In fact, you know, I almost want to say, that they should be 240, but if they add in a proper potential for buffing, they should be 120. But yeah, 120 unit, you've lost 20. You cast a spell on the unit, and you regain 10 of those back, making it, again, a very rewarding unit if you're into micro-intensive stuff, and on the other hand, a really terrible unit if you're not. Now, already there are some considerable problems with that, just as with the Vampire Count's army. How the hell is the AI going to handle this? Because if this is going to be micro-intensive for a human, imagine how this is going to be for the good old-fashioned Rome AI, yeah? There are some potential problems with that, but all in all, we're going to just hope for the moment, because we have no proof to the contrary that the new team over at Creative Assembly know what they're doing. Additionally, the Skeleton Warriors should come in 2 versions in Total Wargame. They should come armed with a shield and melee weapon, like good old-fashioned infantry, and they should also have the option of being equipped with spears to give you a little bit of an anti-cavalry fighting force. Moving on, we have the Skeleton Archers, your relatively basic archers, but with a ballistic skill of 2, which is rather horrible. However, here's the catch. Their special ability is called Arrows of the Asp. These are arrows that have been blessed by one of the gods of Nehekara, or, well, at this point it's not so much a god, really, as just the magic that infuses Nehekara. But the effect is rather interesting. It means that the unit suffers no negative modifiers when shooting, which means that they can shoot onto a unit in heavy cover. They don't give a shit. They'll hit it if they hit it. There's no cover modifiers. They can move and fire, no problem. They can march and fire. They can run and fire, no bloody problem. No negative modifiers whatsoever, but ballistic skill too. Like, that is worse than your average goblin, essentially, so I'm almost tempted to say they should be a 240-man unit, but again, with all of the potential buffs, if properly implemented, give them 120 models, allow them to fire while moving, and still not miss that much. You know, they volley fire, they're not particularly accurate, they're not particularly damaging, but they can move and fire. And of course, if you buff them up with a couple spells, they go up to pretty damn good archers. They're never going to be wood elves by any means, but they would certainly be able to match the archers of, for example, the Empire. And the fact that they ignore cover could be really interesting in siege battles. They would essentially just fire the arrows straight up into the air, and then the arrows would just lock onto units on the walls and zip down onto them. Could be quite interesting. Could also be horrifyingly broken, I grant you, but nevertheless, interesting. Considering their horrible ballistic skill and thereby relatively low missile damage, I don't think it would be too overpowered, but well, it's hard to tell without actually, having tried it, so I think that could be a really interesting unit. Just because of the mobility, being able to move them, and these aren't wood elves, so they're not going to be running away quickly. These are undead, so you will be able to catch them even with standard infantry, should they choose to decide to just walk backwards, firing their bows. Then you've got the Skeleton Horsemen. Now, this is a little bit of a strange unit, really, because it is most definitively not heavy cavalry by any stretch of the goddamn imagination, but at the same time it's not really light cavalry. It's a bit of a strange one. In fact, even calling them cavalry is a little bit problematic. Because, to be completely honest with you, the skeleton horsemen absolutely suck as cavalry units. In tabletop, they are far too expensive for what they actually do, and they're not particularly quick either, and they don't have the ethereal special rule of undead cavalry, so they can't just pass straight through rocky outcroppings or forests, so... They are one of those units that I'm kinda going to just say that should be completely redesigned for a Total War game. Make them a unique light cavalry unit. Make them really weak, but give them 120 models. Make them a really large unit. That is really weak to melee combat, to ranged fire, and all of these things, but there's a lot of them. They can threaten flanks, not because they're a particularly large threat, but because of their numbers. You kinda have to dedicate a unit to deal with them. And of course, they can also be buffed up, although even then they're not that amazing. And they are certainly not somewhere you'd like to place your Tomb King or Prince, because, well, even a fully kitted out Tomb King's just not going to add enough oomph to a unit of skeletal horsemen to really pull anything off. So I would kinda like to see them in a unit of 120 as a kind of super light cavalry, where they essentially are skirmishers. Like, give them javelins, in my honest opinion. Give them javelins, 120-man units, allow them to skirmish, and basically have them be the skirmishers of the Tomb King army, because that would make them a little bit more unique. They are super quick for skirmishers, being mostly, foot troops, but they're not particularly dangerous, but they are still able to, at the very least, be threatening. You don't want them to slip around your lines when they're equipped with javelins, because they could deal with your artillery quite quickly. And of course they could also be used as shielding units to protect the rest of your army from missile fire, although, well, you are going to be losing a lot of them. But with the ability to raise dead units, you could essentially have the skeleton horsemen go out in front of your army, eat a ton of damage, pull them back when there's like 30 or 40 of them left, and then just spend a while reinforcing the unit via magic. Could be interesting. Then we've got a really quite interesting unit, the Skeleton Horse Archer. Now, just like their on-foot cousins, they also have arrows of the asp, and they also can't aim worth an absolute damn. But they have the potential of being the best horse archers in the game if you buff them up with a bit of magic. Add in the fact that their arrows ignore cover and ignore any penalties for shooting against a moving target, a la other horse archers, and you've got a unit that, while it wouldn't be particularly effective against nice big blocks of enemy infantry, as they should come in unit sizes of about 80, and their low ballistic skill should mean that a fully ranked up unit of infantry should take next to no damage from these bastards, virtually nothing. The only reason skeleton archers are effective is because there's 120 of them, so 80 skeleton horse archers wouldn't do much. However, 80 skeleton horse archers against a smaller unit of 80 light cavalry, that could actually work, and they're quick enough to keep ahead of them, and since they are firing on the move with no minuses against hitting a moving target or moving themselves, they could be a really fantastic anti-light cavalry unit. And the Tomb Kings really need a good anti-light cavalry unit because, well, none of their infantry is ever going to be catching them, and they don't have that many units actually capable of catching light cavalry. They've got plenty of units that are capable of catching heavy cavalry or infantry or skirmishers, but they might struggle a bit with dealing with light cavalry, so to make the skeleton horse archers a really good counter to them, I think would be a pretty damn good way of using them. And then, the last of the core choices is the skeleton chariots. And this is a rather interesting core choice because it's one of the heaviest core choices in the game. The Bretonnians have knights in their core choice, yes, but even a Bretonnian knight is not quite as heavy as an entire chariot. And this is a really interesting part of the Kemerian army. Imagine an army, a double stack where you've got 40 units. Okay, you've got a front line of 15 units of skeleton warriors, your basic defensive line. Behind that, you've got 5 units of skeleton archers, just to have a little bit to pick away at the enemy units, yeah? Then you've got 2 commanders, of course, you've got a few mages scattered out throughout the army, you've got 4 units of skeleton horse archers to deal with enemy light infantry, and light cavalry, and just to be a little bit of a skirmishing screen. And then the rest is made almost entirely out of skeleton chariots. You have this really fast, really hard hitting, really hard to deal with bunch of units that could inflict some real damage upon the enemy army, providing that their AI is intelligent enough to actually, hit a unit, go through the unit, and turn around, rather than just, running into the units and then stopping for absolutely no reason, thereby taking away all of the chariot's actual advantage of being a chariot. How I would like them to work is, you'd get a unit of 40 skeleton chariots. Now, this would be more than enough to deal with a unit of infantry, for example, by just basically hit-and-run tactics. But they are extremely weak to enemy cavalry, because it's a hell of a lot harder to just, pass through a unit of cavalry. You're not running over infantry anymore, you're running over a fully armored knight on a horse, So they've got a lot better chance of stopping the chariots. And the chariots should be entirely reliant upon hitting the unit and passing through it. If they are bogged down, they should die really, really, really quickly. Because in the end, a chariot's advantage is its ability to use its weight and size to smash through enemy units, and then just rinse and repeat that tactic. It's not a unit that should be bogged down inside an enemy unit and fighting hand to hand, because that's going to end rather badly. I would like to see 2 types of skeleton chariots though. I'd like to see the good old-fashioned heavy charging chariot, just named Heavy Skeleton Chariot. It's got 2 crew members armed with long spears or 2-handed axes, and they'll simply just swing these weapons at whatever gets close enough while they're charging through the enemy unit. And then a variant named Light Skeleton Chariots. These should come in units of 60 rather than the 40 of the Heavy Chariot, and they should be armed with bows, so that in a unit of 60 you've got 2 men in each chariot plus the driver, so you've essentially got 120 bows, with Arrow of the Asp and everything, but extremely mobile. But on the other hand, they are now chariots, which means that while they have some protection from incoming enemy missile fire along the lines of arrows, however, crossbow bolts or bullets should absolutely tear them to pieces, making them a really interesting skirmishing unit, but not a particularly good stand and shoot unit. Again, this all depends on whether or not Creative Assembly can pull off the chariots correctly, so, well, to begin with, it depends on whether or not Creative Assembly wants to even add the Tomb Kings in, so yeah. We'll have to wait and see on that one, but I have hope for it. The Tomb Kings could be a really interesting army that plays very, very differently from anything we've played before, simply because of their heavy reliance on chariots. Then, moving on, we come to the Tomb Guards. The Tomb Guards are the elite infantry of the Tomb King's army. They are the chosen protectors of the Tomb Kings, and as such they have been equipped is probably the wrong word, they have been honored with far more extensive embalming than the normal soldiers. As such, they have been able to keep a lot more of their human consciousness, and in this case, their fighting skills, which means that they are better than skeleton warriors in every single way. They're more than comparable to human infantry, and they also possess the Killing Blow special rule, which should make them really damn effective against nice big units of monsters. However, being relatively rare, I'd kinda like to see the Tomb Guards tied to your commanders. So let's say you've got a level 1 Tomb King. He has 1 unit of Tomb Guards. That's all he gets, he can't recruit anymore, that's all he has because that's his retinue. Then let's say he levels up to level 2. Now, that is a bit of a fluff bend right there, naturally, because, well, it's not like long-dead kings could suddenly rise in prestige. It's not like their previous lives suddenly gave them more Tomb Guards, certainly. But I think we can accept that for a little bit of a gameplay reason. So again, he's level 2, he still only has 1 unit of Tomb Guards, but then he reaches level 3, now he gets 2 units of them, and every second level like that, up to level 10 for example, he can have additional units of Tomb Guards to a maximum of 5. Which means that your Tomb King's army could start out with a unexperienced, low prestige general, mainly relying on good old-fashioned skeleton warriors to do the brunt of the fighting with only a small number of elite troops, to becoming a really damn powerful army with tons of really dangerous, really good Tomb Guards. It also allows you to evolve the way you play your army a bit. You can go from a very fragile army to a rather tough army with a real solid core of elite infantry. Additionally, of course, Tomb Guards can be buffed, just like the Skeleton Warriors, and if a buff on a unit of Skeleton Warriors makes them the equal of a normal unit of infantry, or perhaps slightly better, a buff on a unit of Tomb Guards, and you've got yourself some proper heavy elite infantry that could even take on Chaos Warriors. And due to that potential power, there needs to be some limitation to them, but I think if you limit them through a tiered system of the general, I think you could probably end up with a reasonable balance. Because, well, statistically, they're not that good unbuffed, but as we are, for the moment, assuming that there will be some ability to buff units in the game, well, buffed up, they could become quite the unstoppable little monsters. Next up, we have the Necropolis Knights. Now, before you start wondering, no, those are not giant snakes that have somehow been embalmed and resurrected, those are constructs, they are artificial creations. And they are being ridden by buffed up Tomb Guards. However, ridden is not really the correct terms. In this case, the Tomb Guard has essentially been linked to his mounts. They are more or less the same unit now. And this allows the Tomb Guards to control his mount far more effectively than just, a good old-fashioned rider and horse, for example. They are also quite fast, and they are certainly the heaviest cavalry unit within the Tomb King's army, and they are a melee grinding type of cavalry, while the Chariots, while also rather heavy, are most definitively the hit-and-run variety. The reason why they are so good in extended melee is the fact that they have a 3+ armor save, which is pretty much the highest within the Tomb King's army, along with high weapon skill and a ton of attacks. The rider plus his mount comes out with a total of 5 attacks apiece, which is quite a lot to say the absolute least, and would probably have some kind of area of effect on units of regular sized infantry. As for unit size, I was originally thinking maybe 60 for this unit, as they are essentially heavy cavalry, but seeing as they have close to twice the attack of your average heavy cavalry unit, I think you could probably make this a unit of 40 or 30. Depending a little bit on how vulnerable you make it to ranged damage. Like, if it's really easy to damage with ranged weapons, which it kind of should be, because, it's a rider on top of a giant snake, it's kind of a big target, but on the other hand, it has a really good armor save. So I would probably say that it should be pretty damn hard to take out these units with good old-fashioned arrows, relatively hard with a good old-fashioned crossbow, and relatively easily if you've got some gunpowder weapons. But of course, on the other hand, you also have to take into consideration that, well, they're giant snakes. They don't move particularly predictably, in fact, they move extremely erratically, so perhaps their greatest protection against ranged units is the fact that they're so goddamn hard to hit. So, yeah, I'd probably end up with a unit of 30 of them, and I'd simply make them pretty damn hard to hit at long ranges, easier up close of course, because, shorter range. But that should mean that they are a pretty damn effective unit when it comes to dealing with enemy monsters and enemy heavy cavalry, and of course it's got a considerable charge, so it will be more than capable of dealing with enemy infantry units as well. As for limitations, well, they are a somewhat rare unit, but not that incredibly rare, so I think you should be allowed to have as many of these units as you want, although their upkeep should of course be rather considerable. Although, again, we're talking about upkeep here for an undead army, so you go like, well, what's the upkeep? Well, it's just a game mechanic at this point. We can't really justify the upkeep because, well, they're not eating, they're not sleeping, they're not drinking, they're not consuming supplies of, well, any type, really, so unless you add in some kind of separate resource along the lines of mana for the undead, I think you should probably just be able to have these normal upkeep units, because unlike a proper nice big unit, well, it doesn't require an upkeep in mana. Like with some units, I would like a resource called mana, that is, it costs simply to limit them, like for example with greater demons, you know, super heavy stuff. I would like there to be some limitations other than just good old-fashioned money, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But in the case of the Necropolis Knights, I think you're fine. They're not that super heavy, so they should be available in whatever numbers you would care to field them. Moving on, you've got the Tomb Scorpion. Now, this is a potentially really interesting unit. I would really like to see this implemented with the special rule, which is named Buried in the Sands, which essentially means that the Tomb Scorpion can come into play after the battle has begun and pop up somewhere on the battlefield. Essentially, it's just been hidden, it's been burrowing underground, stuff like that. I'd like to see them in units of 4 or 5, something along those lines. And I'd like to see the ability to deploy from a table edge, or maybe even just bury underneath the board, because they're not that tough. In tabletop, they only have 3 wounds, which means that if they get charged by a unit of heavy cavalry, for example, the lancers are going to put them down damn fast indeed. So they are very, very much so a hit-and-run unit, despite the fact that, well, they look like massive goddamn scorpions. And they are quite dangerous, like they have Strength 5, which means that they will do some severe damage to large monsters, and 4 attacks with poison and killing blow. But being so fragile, I would really like to see it as a hit-and-run unit. You can deploy it in your army, in which case it'd work much like Chariots, essentially, or maybe you could even combine it with Chariots. The Chariot runs in there, breaks up the enemy formation, and then the Tomb Scorpion moves in for the coup de grace. Alternatively, if you give it the ability to bury down and deploy from, for example, one of the flank table edges or something along those lines, it could be a decent artillery hunter. Although it would have to be really, really fast to really pull off that task, as otherwise it would simply get charged by cavalry with lancers and destroyed. Potentially really interesting unit, potentially useless unit, so it'll be interesting to see if they have any plans for that. But if you were beginning to fear that the Tomb King's army was completely lacking in shock melee units, do not fear. The Tomb Scorpions might not have you covered in that respect, but the Ushabti most certainly do. Now, in tabletop, these guys aren't that good anymore, as they have a somewhat mediocre stat line and they're really, really expensive. But in Total War, I think this could be a really, really interesting unit. Give us a unit of 60 of these magical constructs, give them stat lines roughly equal to that of an ogre, and allow us to buff them, and they could be really, really damn interesting. However, they should be somewhat limited, as the Ushabti are quite complicated to actually make. So I'd probably say you can have 2 of them per army, something along those lines. Or even better, what I would really, really love to see is a dual command system within the Tomb King's army. So when your Tomb King or Tomb Prince levels up, he gets more Tomb Guards, but when you're a mage, which you have to have because you need a Hierophant to keep the army moving, when he levels up, you get access to more constructs. You can take more units of Tomb Scorpions, more units of Ushabti, more units of Carrion Warswings or Necropolis Knights, that kind of stuff. I would really like that, because it would mean that the Tomb King army would be an army that was constantly evolving. Its playstyle would continue to evolve along with you playing it. And it would really keep you from getting bored, wouldn't it? You'd constantly have some new toys to play with. You'd have an army that goes from being relatively fragile, but relatively hard-hitting, to a much more grindy, melee-centric army, to perhaps a much more faster, smaller number elite army. Could be really interesting, and the Ushabti would be a key component in that. With good stat lines equal to that of an ogre, big two-handed melee weapons, a reasonable movement speed, and decent numbers, they could be a fantastic unit for dealing with both enemy monsters and enemy cavalry units. You send in a bunch of skilled spearmen to stop the cavalry, and then you send in the Ushabti to take care of them with their nice big two-handed weapons. Now, I also just mentioned the Carrion war swings, and yes, this is one of the true heavy hitters of the Tomb King's list. A massive stone monstrosity with a howdah on his back that carries tomb guards, or you could even mount your Tomb King on this thing if you really want a nice big bastard unit. The Carrion War Sphinx is a really cool unit that could be amazing in a Total War game. Like, these are elephants on steroids right here. And I'd love to see them in units of like 5 or something, which might be much, but you know, they are big, they are nasty, certainly, but I think they should be available in relatively large units, so that you can use them as the kind of super heavy shock cavalry that they really should be. Have a unit of 5 of them, have them be relatively vulnerable to high-strength weapons, like two-handed weapons wielded by ogres, just two-handed weapons in general, of course gunpowder weapons, that kind of stuff, but have them have an absolutely insane charge. Have them essentially be elephants. And I would also really like to see Creative Assembly take the time to implement the riders properly, since in this case you have 4 tomb guards on top of it, with very long spears that are more than able to actually help out in the fight. It would be an absolute bastard to animate this unit. I'm not even going to pretend it wouldn't, but can you just imagine watching this giant feline monster with the tomb guards with long spears on his backs, rampaging through the enemy units, jumping back and forth in the unit, running through it with the tomb guards stabbing? It would be beautiful. But yeah, it would be an absolute nightmare to animate. Alternatively, you could use them kind of like heavier chariots, essentially. So you have a unit of 5 of them, they attack like chariots, they try to run through the enemy units while the tomb guards are stabbing, and the war swings itself is just swinging around with its tail and jaws and that kind of stuff. And then just running straight through the unit, and turning around and charging through it again. It could be an interesting kind of super heavy chariot unit. But of course, they would be rather ridiculously powerful, so they should be limited, and they are also very rare, so again, yeah. If they would implement a dual command system, I would really like to see that, like so when your Hierophant reaches level 5 or so, he can have 1 unit of these, and then he can have another unit at level 7 and another unit at level 10, for a total of 3 of them, and totaling out at 15 total models. That seems reasonable enough, in my opinion. Nothing too overpowered about that, because you can of course deal with them relatively easily with cannons and that kind of stuff. Because they are rather large, and since they're not flyers or anything, they're probably not going to be dodging cannonballs all that much. Then we've got another monster unit in the form of the Cephalogra Stalkers. The Stalkers are a rather powerful unit with weapon skill 2, strength 4, toughness 4, with 2 attacks, so it's not particularly accurate, but it does hit very nice and hard with its two-handed weapons, making it a pretty damn good anti-big guy unit. I think I'd like them to come in units of about 30. I would maybe say 60, except for the fact that the Stalkers have a bit of a special rule. You see, they have a shooting attack. And in tabletop, the shooting attack works like this. You roll a dice that determines the amount of shots, and the shots are then strength 1, which is pretty damn horrible, but they ignore armor. But here's the interesting part. Instead of targeting the toughness of the enemy unit, you target their initiative. Which essentially just boils down to the fact that many units that would be too tough to damage with a strength 1 attack can now be damaged relatively reliably. It is an extremely specific shooting attack though. I wouldn't like to see it just be a shooting attack. I'd like to see it as a special ability. You can target enemy large units and you cause a bit of damage to them in a kind of a volley fire thing. Now, exactly how you would calculate the damage contra initiative, etc., I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I think I would kind of like to see a bit of an RNG thing here, where every model within the enemy unit that gets shot at or just targeted by the special ability has a 10% chance of getting wounded. Or it might even just be a nice big debuff. I'd kind of like that too. You cast a debuff, you cause a rather considerable drop in the enemy unit's stats, and then you send in the Stalkers to try and finish them off. Personally, I kind of prefer the latter option, because the Cephalogra Stalkers have kind of terrible weapon skill, so give them a special ability that reduces the defense of the enemy unit considerably, as long as they are monstrous infantry, something large like that, which means that now when the Cephalogra Stalkers charge in, they've got a way better chance of hitting the enemy with their nice big two-handed weapons. It would somewhat limit the Stalker's use as an anti-infantry unit, but I don't really think that's a problem. Have them be a dedicated anti-big guy unit, and rather use the Necropolis Knights as your anti-infantry stuff. Again, I think that fits into the Tomb King army, as it does require a bit more micromanagement of your units. You need to pick your targets a little bit more carefully, you know? For the last two units, we have the Tomb King Swarm, which should operate exactly like the 5 other swarms I've described so far up until this point, so I'm not even going to bother touching on that again. But the last special unit is the Carrion, which is, well, it used to be a relatively large vulture, or, well, an absurdly large vulture, really. But now it's a really, really, really bad flyer, at least in tabletops. The thing's rather useless because it can only fly within the general's command range. Because apparently if it goes outside of his command range, your Tomb King is no longer able to tell the bird to flap its goddamn wings, so okie dokie. In a Total War game, however, just let it fly. I don't see any reason not to, depending on how they actually implement flying. The thing has a relatively terrible stat line, although it has a reasonable toughness with 2 wounds and toughness 4, and it does have 3 attacks. It'd be pretty good for dealing with artillery units, but pretty much worthless for, well, anything else, really. I think you'd probably want it in units of, well, again, it depends on how the hell you're actually going to do flying units. If the thing can actually fly around like it will, give it a unit of 5, let it be a War Machine Hunter. If it can only jump or something along those lines, it should probably be a unit of 20 or so, simply because they're not particularly good at fighting, so if you're gonna have them actually engage enemy units, they are going to need a bit of numbers to actually be worth a damn. But, again, since we haven't the faintest how flying units are actually going to work, I'm not going to speculate too much on that. Then, moving on to the rarer units, we start out with the Bone Giant, and no, I will not call it its new name, because if I do, I'm pretty damn sure I'm going to be pronouncing as the Necropolis Colossus, so Bone Giant it is. The Bone Giant is an extremely simple unit. It's a giant. It might be an undead giant, but it's still a giant. It's large, it's strong, it's tough, tons of wounds, low initiative, reasonable amount of attacks. Comes in units of 2, I think, because a living giant could come in a unit of 1, but, well, a living giant is better than a bone giant, so, yeah. Unit of 2, primarily used against enemy monsters, simply because, well, it's large and nasty, although you should keep it away from ogres with 2-handed weapons. or as a large tanking unit. It would be quite effective if you could break up a unit's formation with Chariots first, or Necropolis Knights, and then send in the Colossus to clean up. A very nice 1-2 punch unit, although you do need to support it, because while it is a giant, it is still a dead giant, which means it is rather slow, and so if it gets charged by a unit of ogres with two-handed weapons or something along those lines, odds are it's going to be going away rather quickly. However, the Bone Giant has access to something that could actually be kind of interesting. It has access to a bow. Well, at this point, it's basically a ballista, but it could be a rather interesting thing. Say that you've got 2 units of Bone Giants. You've got the melee version of 2 units, but they have melee weapons, so they get some proper AoE when fighting smaller units. And then you've got the bow version, which comes in a total of 4 models, which essentially act as bolt thrower artillery, but of course they are pretty damn terrible in melee. Seeing as the best they could probably do was to stomp up and down on units, something like that. Well, 4 might be too much simply because they'd be pretty hard to deal with by small units, so maybe 3 units with a relatively low fire rate. It's kinda hard to tell, you know, but if you buff it up a bit with Tomb King's magic, they might be too effective at 3 models, but at the same time, don't really want to go below that either, so I'm a little bit torn on that one, but I would definitely like to see them, at the very least, have the option to either go with the melee variant or the ranged variant. As for limitations, they're not actually quite that rare, because there's a fair few of them stationed around Khemri, but again, I'd love a dual command system where you could actually have these guys, so maybe at max level you could have 2 or 3 units of them. Otherwise, I'd probably limit them to 1 or 2 per army, simply because if you have an entire army of giants, well, odds are you're either going to be completely destroyed by enemy monster units, if there's tons of them, or you're going to be absolutely stomping all over the enemy army, so some kind of limitation is certainly in order. Then you've got the Hero Titan, which is essentially a bone giant, except this one, for some reason, casts spells. Oh, well, technically not spells, but it's got 2 bound spells, minor magical missiles, essentially. Meaning that what you really have, you've got a bone giant that's slightly worse in melee combat, probably only a single model, for example, but then you give it roughly the same melee impact as a bone giant, with a basic shooting attack. Not a super powerful one, but it's definitely something to consider when, well, it is still a giant, so, you know, it's not by any means bad in melee combat, and it could be an interesting unit to pair up with the Bone Giant. So you've got the Bone Giants being into melee stompy, and you've got the Hero Titan supporting with a bit of magic, since magic, well, he can control it, so there's no real chance of it hitting the Bone Giants. Still, it's a bit of an odd unit because, well, it's a giant, it's expensive, it's limited, and yet it's not particularly good, is it? So I'm not entirely sure about that one. It's one of, honestly, several Tomb King's units that have gotten hit pretty damn hard with the nerf stick over the course of Games Workshop years of balancing tabletop, to the point where I'm kind of wondering what its actual, you know, objective is. Is it a melee unit? Well, not really, because if you'd want a melee unit, you'd just take a Bone Giant instead. Is it a caster? No, it only has 2 bound spells, and they're not particularly effective. Now, what I could say, if they do implement a magic system along the lines of the tabletop, where you've got dispel dice, so you need to carefully control the amount of dispel dice you have so to counter enemy spells, that could actually be interesting, because you have bound spells. Well, does the enemy want to counter them? In so case, he has to waste some of his anti-spell resources doing it, and with Tomb Kings having a ton of spells, well, you can essentially just wear down their magical defenses and allow you to cast spells at your will later on in the game. Could work, but then again, since we don't know how magic will work, yeah, I'm somewhat in the dark on how this unit would actually be useful, but we'll have to wait and see. Then we've got a unit that is most definitively quite useful. It is the Screaming Skull Catapult. Now, of course, it is just a catapult, except it has some rather fascinating ammunition. It doesn't fire rocks, it fires skulls infused with magical energy, so they scream and bounce around and do all kinds of horrifying things, which cause a leadership penalty to the unit that it's hitting. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but it continuously tears away at the unit's morale, which could be a really interesting thing in a Tomb King's army. Imagine you've got a unit of 4 Screaming Skull Catapults. They're hitting a nice big fat unit of enemy elite infantry in the center of their army, tearing away at their morale. Now you send in your Chariots that can charge through the unit, do a bunch more damage, and maybe lower their morale even more. Maybe even finishing it off. Again, it would be a nice potential 1-2 punch. Alternatively, of course, in a Total War game, you simply could just make it a good old-fashioned catapult and have it fling large rocks at the enemy. It'd still work, but I would kind of like the skulls alternative, because, well, it's a little bit more Tomb King-y, and it requires a little bit more of coordination to get the most out of it. Then, for the last unit, we've got the Casket of Souls. In tabletop, this is really good indeed, especially against low leadership nations, like for example the Skaven. This thing is an absolute bloody nightmare, because it casts a bound spell again, so you've got to dispel it and use your limited resource of dispel if you want to actually stop it. But when it hits a unit, it forces the unit to take a leadership test on 3d6s. So let's say the unit has leadership of 10, yeah? So you need to roll a 10 on 3d6. But let's say you don't roll a 10, you roll a 5. The effect then is that you take wounds equal to the amount that you failed by. So in this case you failed by 5, so the unit takes 5 automatic wounds, no armor save, no nothing, 5 models in the unit, just keel over dead. A potentially devastating weapon against low leadership races. In tabletop though, this works, but in Total War, probably not. In all due likelihood, it's simply going to have to be some kind of magical artillery, with maybe a bound spell, something along the lines of the Hero Titan, for example. Again, if they do implement magic so that you have a finite amount of defensive magic at your available, again, if they implement magic in such a way that you have a finite amount of anti-magic, so to say, the Casket of Souls could be one of the many ways that the Tomb Kings use to wear away at those defenses, making sure that they can actually use their buffing magic at will later on in the game. Again, could be a very interesting unit if they implement it like that, but if they just make magic an artillery strike, for example, again, you've got a unit that is kinda not that useful? I don't know, it's kinda hard to say, really. To be completely honest with you, I'm pretty sure the Tomb Kings is the race that has the absolute bloody least chance of getting into a Total War game, simply because they have a lot of stuff that would be really hard. Like, the Chariots alone would be problematic, shall we just say. So, we will have to wait and see. Until then, this has been my thoughts on the Tomb King's army. I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.